My name is Yehonason Alpren, and I would like to discuss the topic of a searching soul. I was once sitting on a plane going to the United States, and sitting next to me in the economy class was a young man. He was about 30 or so, who had a magnificent iPod, I think, in front of him, and he had a movie which he was watching at the same time. He was wearing a most beautiful watch. His clothes were really very immaculate. He looked very good. And I could see he was an affluent, successful young man. But then I thought to myself, but 1 minute, why is he sitting next to me like a sardine in the economy class? If he's really made it, he would be in business class or first class. When you come out of an airport and you're like confronted, almost bombarded by every possible enticement by the shops in the airport lounge, it's all in the same aspect of to entice and to possibly draw in the attention to buy something which you perhaps don't even need, but because of the attraction of the propaganda, you're caught in to buy it. You think you need it, maybe a new camera, maybe a new pair of shoes, or something which in the world of the consumer market, the world of advertising and the media, keeps on pushing you and driving you that perhaps you need this and you're lacking without it. Of course, in the world of media, we know that the skill of a really perfect advert is to almost convince you that how did you ever manage in life without using this perfume? How can you survive in life without driving this type of car? If you never smoked this type of cigarette, then you really have never tasted luxury in your life. And it goes on and on. And it works. Where's the proof, the evidence that it works? Simply because the advertising world is they spend so much money and they keep on spending money. So pumping money into advertising, clearly, it makes a difference and it's successful. In this short lecture, I'd like to make a suggestion. What happens when a person is caught up in this magnetic pull of the consumer market? And you actually do believe that you're missing something. And if I don't have this new suit or this new dress, or if I don't buy this perfume, what happens when you do buy it? What happens the next day? Well, that enticement has gone and you're caught on to the next. And that's the way the consumer market works. There's a trap. The problem is we all get caught into the trap, and we have to try and stand away from the trap and avoid its cunning, because clearly that's really not the success story in life. Because once a person gets dragged in, it's like a whirlpool. You're continually being told that you're missing something when you're really not. And they succeed in brainwashing you, and you keep on searching for more and more. But every time you buy whatever the material object of desire is, the next day it's something else. And that's where the trap is. I remember I was once sitting in a kitchen, a magnificent kitchen in Far Rockaway in New York, and I was having a cup of tea, I remember, and a woman walked into the kitchen. It was a magnificent kitchen. She stood in the kitchen and looked around. And then, I don't know, maybe she shouldn't have blurted out, but she cried out and said, "Why don't I have a kitchen like this? Why didn't my husband buy me?" And she went on. I don't know, maybe she thought I wasn't sitting there, but it was pathetic. I'm sure, looking at all the other homes around in the area, she probably had a magnificent kitchen, but it was something that she didn't have. She was obviously caught up in this whirlpool of material acquisitions, and it was an awful comment to hear, because I almost felt like turning around and say, "Lady, what's wrong with what you have?" But that's the problem in the consumer society. You get caught up and you're not aware of it until you see something else, and then you want that, and it moves on and on and on. I'd like to suggest an alternative way of living, almost perhaps an antidote and a solution to this continual trap of searching for material acquisitions. The wisest of all men, we're told, was King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech. He wrote a book at the end of his life, which was called Koheles. In English, it's called Ecclesiastes. In chapter 6, verse 7, I think he gives the answer to this enormous enticement in the materialistic society. Kol amal ha'odom lepihu. Every effort which a man makes is for his mouth, for his consumption. V'gam ha'nefesh lo timole. But the soul is never full. Now, why not? If he's continually feeding his mouth, of course, the commentators explain that the mouth does not mean the mouth, literally it means the home, the fixtures, the furnishings, the appliances, the clothing, the wardrobe, whatever it is. It doesn't just mean pihu means consumption. But the problem is, but why isn't it full? Surely you can fill up a wardrobe. You can fill up a home with fixtures and fittings and furniture and replica, whatever you want to fill it up with. But why isn't it full? What does King Solomon mean when he says, "V'hanefesh lo timole," that really it's never full? I think this is what he means. Our constitution, on a spiritual basis, physically we know we have a body and we have a mouth and we have limbs and functions which all have to function according to the food, the exercise, the sleep, the air, the good life, which is all a physical existence. But we have also a spiritual existence. In very broad general terms, it's called a nefesh, a ruach, and a neshama. A nefesh means the lowest level of spiritual, which means physical activity. All actions are governed by the nefesh, which means physical actions. Higher than that, we have something called a ruach, a spirit, a ruach chaim, a spirit of life. That gives speech and motivation. It's more ethereal, it's more aesthetic than the physical side, which is clearly you can see a person swings his arms, a person walks. That's the nefesh. Higher than that is speech and motivation, the ruach. And higher than that is called the neshama, which is the place of thought, of cognizance, of memory, of emotions as well. It's more aesthetic. It's the place of the neshama. Maisa, dibur, machshava. Nefesh, ruach, neshama. And therefore we see that a person in his constitution, how he's made up, is not just a physical person. He also has a spiritual life as well. Meaning that if you fill yourself up with food, you'll feel satisfied physically, but that's not enough. Kol amal ha'odom lepihu, as much as you fill yourself up with consumer items and you become satisfied, why the hanefesh lo timole? Because you didn't satisfy the other appetite. There's something called a spiritual need as well. A person must have what's called, in Hebrew, mozon ruchni, spiritual nourishment as well as physical nourishment. And it's never enough if you just concentrate on physical needs. Let me explain to you an episode that once happened to my wife and I several years ago. I live in Jerusalem, and our children were growing up. And whenever we had any used clothing or money for charity, we would go down to next to the Mir Yeshiva. There used to be a famous lady who lived there who was called Esther Segal. She lived right next to the Mir Yeshiva in Meir Shorim. And we would take her whatever clothing we had which we didn't need, or charity money. She was known as a woman who collected in clothing and gave it out to poor people, and also money as well. We also knew as well a little bit of her history, her background. She was unfortunately a widow, very young, and she single-handedly brought up 9 children, all by herself. And a brave woman, and also a righteous woman, a very famous woman in Jerusalem in her time. We went and we stood at her door, and the conversation, as usual, went on to children. And I think my wife turned around and said to her, it's not easy finding a good education for children. And she turned around almost with a nonchalant grin and said, in Yiddish, nicht kein Problem. It's not such a serious problem. Really? Then we said we're also in the period of our lives where we're marrying off our children, and she seemed to, everything was glib, everything was easy, and we found it almost careless in her responses of what she was saying, and she was by no means a careless woman. And we couldn't understand how all these responses were just carefree. And clearly a woman of a widow, a young lady bringing up 9 children, and her reputation, it was clearly her answers. We were missing something of how she had managed. And then she, as they say, I suppose, let the cat out of the bag. She turned around and said to us in Yiddish, weil ich hab a reiche Tata. I have a very rich father. And there was a beautiful twinkle in her eye. And I remember when she said those words, I have a very rich father, I remember looking at my wife and saying, well, lucky lady you. If you have a rich father, and everything is taken care of. And then we looked back at her, and the twinkle and the grin in her eye, and we realized, well, I also have the rich father. Here was a lady who had filled up her spiritual investments with spiritual acquisitions. I don't think she had much physically, but spiritually, it was quite clear. She had tremendous bitachon, which means in English, security, from the word batuach. She was sure, she was confident in her trust in the Almighty. Listening to her and looking at her, it was like her life was covered with a rich veneer of highly polished trust in the Almighty. A woman who was confident with her trust in the Almighty. There wasn't much worry in her eyes, hardly any. There was very little fear, and yet she really didn't have much. She lived almost in a little hovel. How come she was so happy? What happened here in her life that she could turn around with a big smile and say, bringing up children and marrying them off, and she'd done a tremendous job, and each of her children were exceptional. I heard once about her families. How did she manage it? Her rich father had helped her. Here was a woman who had received a tremendous amount of spiritual nourishment in her life, and therefore she was able to cope in quite a different way. I remember I once taught a girl in one of the seminaries in Jerusalem, and she had gone away for Shabbos and came and spoke to me after the Shabbos. She'd spent a Shabbos with a girl. She came from a very wealthy home, and she'd gone and spent a Shabbos with a friend from her area who was married about 10 years or so and living in a 2-room apartment in Jerusalem, I think with 6 children. And the girl came from an extremely wealthy family, the girl who she'd gone to visit. And she came back to me, and this is what she told me. She said, I'm so angry. I said, why? She said, I went to spend Shabbos with a girl who came from an extremely wealthy home. And I'm upset because this woman is so blissfully happy with so little, and yet I've never ever seen my mother ever as happy as this woman is. And my mother has everything, a car in the drive, appointments at the cosmetician. She has a full wardrobe, and my mother has never in her life, as far as I can remember, been as happy as this woman was, who had 6 children in 2 rooms and hardly any money, yet what she came from. There's something called where the soul has to stop searching, where there comes a point when a person has to recognize, I suppose, that in this material world of acquisitions, that the more one gets caught up in the trap, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be full. What King Solomon says, "V'hanefesh lo timole," he means that you won't feel satisfied. You'll just need for more. In the words of Chazal, "Mi sheyesh lo mone roitze matayim," someone who has 100 wants 200. But that's the materialistic society. The way we're made is that our spiritual side, our nefesh, our ruach, our neshama, our spiritual organs as such, they also need nourishment. If they get nourishment together with our physical side, then you can feel full and satiated in life. I'd like to bring you another passage from King Solomon, from a different book which he wrote when he was younger, called Shir HaShirim, the Book of Psalms. It describes the searching of a soul, but in a different way. And this was from Perek 3, verse Aleph, in Shir HaShirim. I'd like to read it out in Hebrew and translate. I hope you catch the mood of what King Solomon is trying to give over here in this permanent, persistent search of the neshama, but what happens when you eventually find what you're looking for. Al mishkovi baleilos, on my bed at night, bikashti, I searched, es she'ohava nafshi, for he who I loved. If you know a little bit, Shir HaShirim is talking, they think it's a love song. It's between a man and a woman, and they each express each other. But of course, the woman referred to here is the Jewish nation, and the bridegroom is called the Almighty. And therefore, the bride, the Jewish nation, searches for the Almighty. On my bed at night, I searched for the one who I love. It means, of course, a teenage Jew searching for belief in the Almighty. Bikashtiv, v'lo motzosiv. I searched, but I never found. Just because a person looks for the Almighty, it doesn't mean to say that you find him straight away. You must keep on going. Okumana. I got up. Va'asoivav ba'ir, and I wandered around the city. Bashvokim, in the markets. Ba'ochovos, in the streets. Avaksha es she'ohava nafshi. I searched for the one who I love. Bikashtiv v'lo motzosiv, but I still didn't find him. Even if you make efforts, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll find the Almighty straight away. It needs a lot of searching. It's not enough to want to find him. One has to put great effort into actually searching for him. And even if you go wandering around, many unfortunately go wandering off to India and Pakistan and Afghanistan and Burma and searching for different religions, and they're searching for the meaning of life. But just because you're searching, it doesn't mean to say that you'll find. Mutsauni hashaimrim, the guards found me. Hasoivavim ba'ir, those who surround the city. Esho'ava nafshi re'isem, I asked them, did you see the one who I'm looking for? Who are the guards referring to here? What does King Solomon mean that I found people and I asked them? I would like to suggest it means movie stars. It means sports idols. It means people who capture the hearts of youth and they begin to believe in them, but they're really nothing more than idols. They're really not real profiles of people to believe in, but they're successful at sports, successful, great movie stars or singers. I remember hearing that in one of the great yeshivas in Israel, when John Lennon of the Beatles had died, so one of the leaders, one of the rabbonim of the yeshiva, explained that this is one of the shomrim hasoivavim ba'ir who has just died. He had a great impact, he and his wife, on the youth. He captured their imagination, he captured their hearts. but he wasn't by any means a god, but people believed in him. That was a trap. It wasn't the real thing, but still the search resumes. You're looking for him, but you don't find him straight away. Kim'at she'ovarti mehem. I walk past all these guards. In other words, I dismiss the movie stars, the singers, the political figures, the so-called leaders, but they're not the Almighty. They're people who might have a great deal of glamour and stardom, but they're not really the heroes of life. Ad shemotzosi es sha'ava nafshi. I found the one who I loved. Eventually, after a great deal of searching for the Almighty, which every Jew, I imagine, in his teenage years and a little bit later as well, searches and searches for the Almighty, you find him. If you keep on searching, you find him. Achaztiv, I will hold on to him. V'lo alpenu, I will not let go. Ad shehevesiv el beis imi ve'el chedem oirosi, until I brought him back to my parents' home. It means to internalize him. We learn from these verses of King Solomon that in order to find emunah and bitochen, faith and trust in the Almighty, you need to search. But you don't find straight away. You can perhaps get distracted and deflected on the way, and you can get caught up in something else, which you think is very attractive at the time, but it doesn't mean to say that it really is what you're really searching for. When I was growing up, I grew up in a city called Birmingham in England. I remember I had a friend who was an outstanding linguist. He knew, I think, 5 languages from his home, French and German and Spanish and Italian. And he was remarkable at languages. And I remember he was offered a scholarship to Oxford University at the age of 18 with almost a free scholarship, everything paid for, to go and study languages there. And he was an outstanding brain. And we used to learn Torah together on Shabbos afternoon. I remember after the first year, he came back and he had no interest in learning anymore on Shabbos afternoon. I think after the second semester, he removed his kappel. He wasn't interested in anything to do with Jewish religion. He was completely caught up in the university union, in the university life. He searched and he found what he thought he was looking for. By the 3rd year, he was onto drugs. I think the 4th year, he had died. It was a tragedy. He was caught up in a society where they search for, I suppose, what you could call materialistic highs. And he was lost, he drifted, and eventually he lost his own life because he got caught up and dragged into a search which was not the real search. He didn't understand really what to search for in life and got caught up and lost his life as a result of it. It's a trap. Not everybody has the enormous privilege of Esther Segal, of finding the reiche Tata, of finding the rich father. But one has to persevere and keep on trying and looking and searching for the Almighty with good mentors that help you on the way and to ensure that you don't get distracted with the wrong aim and the wrong goals and the wrong idols. One of the greatest thinkers in the Jewish religion was Reb Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. He lived in Italy. He came to Eretz Yisrael, to Israel. He died in a plague in Acre with all his family, and by the age of 40, he was buried next to Rabbi Akiva in Tiberia. He was an outstanding thinker, a philosopher, both of the revealed Torah and the hidden aspects, the Kabbalah, the mysteries of Torah. And he wrote a book called Derech Hashem, The Way of Hashem. And there is a passage inside the book which I think is very relevant and can give a tremendous amount of enlightenment of what really the search is all about. He talks about the Jewish calendar. Let me explain, first of all, in the non-Jewish world, what does the calendar really represent? You go through different seasons, different periods, and there's periods of Thanksgiving, and there's periods of celebration, but in reality, whatever you celebrate in the calendar is really only historic. what happened perhaps in history if there's anything to celebrate, like Thanksgiving or Columbus's Day or Lincoln's Day or the 25th of December. They're historical dates which are important in the calendar. But he explains that the Jewish calendar is a cycle which you keep on going back into it. Let's start with the most regular and the most routine of all. Every 6 days, when it comes to Shabbos, everything is supposed to wind down. There are no emails, there are no iPhones, there are no newspapers. You're supposed to connect with the light of the holiness of Shabbos. Shabbos is a day of Kedusha. It begins with Kiddush and ends with Havdalah. It's 24 hours when a person is supposed to consider the enormous beauty of the world, that the world has a creator. There's not a world without a designer, a director, a manufacturer. Hashem completed the world and left the seventh day, Shabbos, as a day of Kedusha. Yom zeh mechubad mikol ha'amim. It's a unique day, a day when the searching switches from physical needs, where you uplift food and you uplift dress, you dress and eat special and perhaps eat in a special room for the honor of Shabbos, for the holiness of Shabbos. It's a moment when the searching changes completely in dimension from a materialistic world of looking to see what's happening in my bank account, with my shares, with my portfolio, with my business. Telephones are kept quiet. Newspapers are out of bounds. One is supposed to spend the day studying Torah, talking in aspects of Torah, in prayer. It's a day of Kedusha, but holiness which is clearly defined in aspects of Kedusha. So you receive an aspect of Kedusha, of holiness, from the day itself. Pesach, which comes in the springtime, in the month of Nisan, we go again back into the redemption from Egypt. It's not a historical day when we celebrate the going out of Egypt. It is what happened. But once again, it's called Leil Shimurim, a night of protection, when we once again go into the whole aspect of enlightenment and redemption of the Jewish nation, the birth of the Jewish nation as they left Egypt and wandered into the desert, following the clouds and listening to the Almighty. That's an enormous light which exists for 7 days, which is the holiness and the searching of the soul which it receives during these 7 days. Shavuos is the time of the giving of the Torah. It's not just a historical day of when the Jews received the Torah. It's much more than that. Once again, we receive the Torah. True, we don't go to the Mount Sinai and we don't listen to the voice of the Almighty, but the day is reminiscent and we receive the same ability of light, of renewal, of renaissance, of holiness, which pumps us up together, and we move on in our acquisition of spiritual gain until the next Yom Tov, which is Sukkot. Again, we're in the Sukkah. We don't go into the desert. But the light, says the Ramchal, says Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, is there again and present again at each of these festivals, similarly with Hanukkah and with Purim and the fast days. It's not a historical calendar. It's a current, topical awareness that we are living in a life of holiness rather than just living a life of material acquisition. The searching changes from our bank, from our employees, from our needs physical. We have everything provided before Shabbos and Yom Tov. But the day has a different mindset. It's a day of Kedusha. One of the most beautiful songs that we sing, Zemiros of Shabbos, are Kol Mekadesh Shvi'i Koroyu Loi. Kol Shomer Shabbos Kados Meichalaloi. Anybody who sanctifies Shabbos in the correct way, anybody who is careful from doing any aspects of work on the day, Schora Harbe Ma'od, his reward is very great, according to what he does, how much he puts into Shabbos. Of course, if Shabbos just becomes a a day of eating delicacies and getting dressed up, then you're missing out on the searching of the soul, of the spiritual nourishment that a person can gain from Shabbos, and similarly with any of the Yom Tovs. It's much more than that. It's a day of prayer, it's a day of studying Torah, it's a day when a person gets uplifted, and therefore the calendar promotes this spiritual nourishment, which you collect every single week on Shabbos and every Yom Tov as it comes around. That's the nature of the searching soul. If you remain in the shopping malls, at the airport lounges, or if you remain just enticed by materialistic possessions and acquisitions, it's extremely dull and it becomes an enormous trap, because the watch is never good enough as the person next to you who has a better watch, or there's another car which is even better than that. The trap and the pit is endless. Once you get caught up, you're just feeding the physical needs, v'hanefesh lo timole, but you never really get full because you're not receiving spiritual nourishment. Spiritual nourishment is the other side of our existence. Of course you need the physical, you need the clothing, you need the food, you need the whatever it is, but that's only one side of existence. Of course, the more a person climbs and grows and appreciates the importance of spiritual acquisitions, the physical side gets less and diminishes, and the spiritual grows. But that's perhaps later. At an early stage, just to recognize the need of a searching soul, of what it means to have not just a physical body, but also a nefesh, a ruach, and a neshama, a different life, a different existence, which gets helped along every week on Shabbos, and also from the Yom Tovim, the Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkos, and of course the mitzvahs and the Torah that we get involved in. These are all what's called spiritual nourishment. And therefore, if one has that together with the physical, then you can feel full and satisfied. And the searching soul has almost a closing appetite. You can rest and you can stop and you can be calm. In Yiddish, there's an expression called baruikt, to become calm and not always chasing after the next acquisition, which just leads you on to another one. I suppose the highest level is Esther Segal, when with great nonchalance, but with great confidence and great optimism, she turned around and said, but I have a reiche Tata, I have a rich father. The dependence and the awareness of the Almighty and bringing him into one's life on a daily basis, this search in the soul begins to become abated, and you become far more satisfied and appeased in life. Thank you.